What if I told you that the greatest source of your suffering is not the difficulties you face in life, but the illusion that there is a permanent, unchanging self that needs to be protected, defended, and satisfied at all costs? What if everything you believe about who you are, this solid sense of I that seems so real and undeniable, is actually a construction, a story your mind has been telling you for so long that you have forgotten it is just a story? I have spent decades studying and practicing the Buddha's most radical teaching, the doctrine of Anatta, which literally means non-self. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that understanding this teaching has the power to dissolve your ego and liberate you from suffering in ways that will transform your entire existence. This is not a mental trick or a philosophical game. This is the path walked by the Buddha himself and countless enlightened beings who discovered that the self we believe we are protecting does not actually exist in the way we think it does, and that this realization is the doorway to complete freedom. Before we journey into this profound teaching that will challenge everything you think you know about yourself, I invite you to make a sacred declaration. In the comments below, write these words: I release attachment and embrace impermanence. When you write this phrase, you are not erasing yourself or becoming nothing. You are declaring your willingness to see through the illusion of a fixed, permanent self and discover the freedom that lies beyond the prison of ego. You are opening the door to a liberation so complete that you cannot even imagine it from where you are standing now. This is the first step on a journey that will dissolve the heaviest burden you have been carrying your entire life, the burden of defending and maintaining an ego that was never real to begin with. Let me speak to you honestly about what your ego is and why it causes you so much suffering. From the moment you wake up in the morning, your ego is at work, constantly telling you stories about who you are. I am successful, or I am a failure. I am loved, or I am rejected. I am important, or I am worthless. I am right and they are wrong. I deserve this. I do not deserve that. Every day you spend enormous energy maintaining this sense of self, defending it when it is threatened, inflating it when it is praised, protecting it from anything that might challenge or diminish it. When someone criticizes you, why does it hurt so much? Because you identify yourself with that criticism, as if it attacks the very core of who you are. When you do not get what you want, why does disappointment feel so heavy? Because your ego believes it deserves certain outcomes and experiences failure as a personal assault on your worth. This constant effort to maintain, protect, and satisfy the ego is exhausting, is it not? You are like someone carrying a heavy stone on their back, climbing a steep mountain, never able to set it down because you believe the stone is who you are. The Buddha called this suffering dukkha, and he taught that the root cause of this suffering is our ignorance, our avidya, about the true nature of reality. We believe in a permanent, unchanging self that must be defended and satisfied, but this belief is a fundamental mistake. It is like building your entire life on a foundation that does not exist. The Buddha discovered that when you look closely at what you call I or me or mine, you cannot find any permanent, unchanging essence anywhere. What you find instead is a constantly changing process of experiences, thoughts, feelings, and sensations that you have labeled as self, but there is no solid entity at the center. Or many centuries ago, a prince named Siddhartha sat beneath a tree and committed himself to understanding the truth of existence. Through the night, he observed his own mind with unwavering attention, and he saw something that changed everything. He saw that what he had been calling self was actually composed of 5 aggregates, 5 constantly changing processes that work together to create the illusion of a permanent identity. There was the physical body, constantly aging and transforming. There were sensations, pleasant and unpleasant feelings arising and passing away moment by moment. There was perception, the mind recognizing and labeling experience. There were mental formations, the thoughts, emotions, and patterns of conditioning that shape our responses. And there was consciousness, the awareness of all these processes. When he looked for something permanent, something unchanging that could be called a self, he found nothing. Everything was in constant flux, everything was impermanent, and there was no fixed entity holding it all together. This discovery was so profound, so liberating, that he devoted the rest of his life to teaching others how to see this truth for themselves. The first teaching the Buddha gave after his enlightenment was the 4 Noble Truths. And at the heart of these truths is the understanding that our belief in a permanent self is what creates and perpetuates suffering. The first noble truth acknowledges that life contains suffering. You know this intimately. Your fear of death, your anxiety about what others think of you, your constant need to prove yourself, your worry that you are not enough, all of this is dukkha. The second noble truth reveals that suffering arises from tanha, craving, and upadana, clinging or attachment. We crave experiences that will make our ego feel good, and we cling to an identity that we believe needs to be maintained and protected. But here is what the Buddha discovered: this ego you are protecting, this self you are trying to satisfy, is a phantom. And the third noble truth is where hope enters, and this is crucial for you to understand. The Buddha taught that it is possible to end suffering completely, not by improving or perfecting the self, but by seeing through the illusion of self entirely. This liberation is called nirvana, and it is described as the realization of anatta, the direct understanding that there is no permanent, unchanging self anywhere to be found. When you truly see this, when you experience it not just intellectually but in your direct awareness, the ego dissolves like a dream dissolves when you wake up, and what remains is something infinitely more vast and free than the small anxious self you have been defending all your life. The fourth noble truth is the path to this realization, the noble eightfold path that trains your mind to see clearly through right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. To understand the power of anatta to dissolve your ego, you must first understand the three marks of existence that the Buddha taught characterize all phenomena. The first mark is anicca, impermanence. Everything that exists is constantly changing, never remaining the same even for a single moment. Your body is aging and transforming every second. Your thoughts arise and dissolve like bubbles on water. Your emotions come and go like weather patterns. The person you were yesterday is not quite the same person you are today. Nothing stays fixed. This applies not just to things outside you, but to what you call yourself. There is no permanent you that remains unchanged through time. The second mark is dukkha, the suffering that arises when we cling to impermanent phenomena and try to build a permanent self out of them. This is the suffering of the ego constantly trying to maintain itself in a world where nothing lasts, constantly fighting against the truth of change. The ego seeks pleasure and runs from pain, accumulates achievements and fears losing them, builds an identity and defends it desperately. All of this effort is based on the mistaken belief that there is a real self that can be made secure through these activities. But because everything is impermanent, this effort is doomed to fail, and the failure creates suffering. The third mark is anatta itself, non-self, and this is the teaching that has the power to dissolve your ego completely. When the Buddha looked deeply into experience, he asked a radical question: where is this self that I think I am? Is it in my body? But my body is constantly changing, made up of elements that come from outside me, food and water and air, that transform and pass through and leave. How can I call this changing body me? Is it in my feelings? But feelings arise and pass away, pleasant becoming unpleasant, happiness turning to sadness. They have no stability. Is it in my thoughts? But thoughts come from conditions, arise from the past, from culture, from habit, and they dissolve as quickly as they appear. Is it in my consciousness? But consciousness requires an object to be conscious of. Without something to be aware of, there is no consciousness. It too is dependent, not independent. When you look closely, really closely, at every aspect of what you call yourself, you find only changing processes, only phenomena arising from conditions and passing away. So where is the self? The Buddha's answer is radical and liberating. There is no permanent, unchanging, independent self anywhere to be found. What we call the self is a convenient label for a collection of constantly changing aggregates, but it is not a real entity. It is like calling a river by a name, but the water is never the same from moment to moment. The river has no permanent essence. It is just a process of flowing water that we label for convenience. In the same way, what you call I is just a process of constantly changing experiences that you have labeled as yourself, but there is no permanent you at the center of it all. Now you might be thinking, but I experience myself. I know that I exist. I think and feel and act. How can you say there is no self? This is a crucial misunderstanding to clarify. The Buddha did not teach that you do not exist in any sense. He taught that you do not exist as a permanent, unchanging, independent entity. You exist as a process, as a constantly changing flow of experience, but you do not exist as a fixed self. This distinction is everything. When you believe in a fixed self, you spend your whole life trying to protect and maintain something that is actually just a fabrication of your mind. This creates enormous suffering because you are fighting against reality itself. The ego, that sense of being a separate, permanent self that needs to be defended, is what Buddhism identifies as the primary source of suffering. Consider how the ego operates in your daily life. When someone disagrees with you, the ego takes it personally. It feels attacked and must defend itself. When you make a mistake, the ego experiences shame because it believes the mistake says something about the worth of yourself. When you achieve something, the ego inflates with pride, taking credit and comparing itself to others. When you fail, the ego deflates with worthlessness. All of these reactions are based on the illusion that there is a permanent self whose value is being measured. But what if there is no fixed self to be threatened? What if there is just experience arising and passing away, with no one at the center who needs to take it all personally? This is the power of Anatta to dissolve your ego. When you truly understand, not just intellectually but in your direct experience, that there is no permanent self, the ego has nothing to stand on. It is like a building that was constructed on an imaginary foundation. When you see that the foundation was never there, the building collapses on its own. You do not have to fight against the ego or try to destroy it through force. You simply see through the illusion that created it, and it dissolves naturally. Let me teach you how to practice this seeing, how to use mindfulness to observe the constructed nature of the self and allow the ego to release its grip on your consciousness. Find a quiet place where you can sit comfortably without disturbance. Close your eyes and bring your attention to your breath, allowing it to anchor you in the present moment. As you breathe, I want you to begin observing your experience with a specific question in mind. Where is the self? Start with your body. Notice the sensations arising in your body right now. Perhaps there is tingling, warmth, pressure, coolness. Notice that these sensations are constantly changing. They arise, they shift, they pass away. Ask yourself, are these sensations me, or are they just sensations being observed? When you have a pain in your foot, you say, "My foot hurts," not "I hurt." There is already a natural understanding that the foot is not quite the same as you. Take this further. Notice that all physical sensations are just events happening in awareness. They are not you. They are experiences being known by awareness. Now bring your attention to your thoughts. Notice that thoughts are arising in your mind. Maybe thoughts about this practice, thoughts about something you need to do later, thoughts judging how well you are meditating. Instead of identifying with these thoughts, instead of assuming I am thinking, notice that thinking is simply happening. Thoughts arise from conditions, from memories, from habits, from reactions to present circumstances. They appear in your awareness and then dissolve. Are they you, or are they just mental events passing through the space of consciousness? When you observe thoughts this way, when you see them as objects of awareness rather than identifying yourself as the thinker, something begins to shift. There is awareness of thinking, but no solid thinker that can be found. Now notice your emotions and feelings. Perhaps there is calmness, curiosity, frustration, boredom, peace. Whatever is present, observe it the way you would observe a cloud passing through the sky. Emotions arise from causes and conditions. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They change and transform. Are they you, or are they just emotional weather patterns moving through the space of your experience? When you are sad, you can notice sadness is present rather than I am sad. This subtle shift in language reflects a profound shift in understanding. There is no permanent self that is sad. There is just the experience of sadness arising and eventually passing away. As you continue this practice, begin to notice awareness itself. There is awareness of sensations, awareness of thoughts, awareness of emotions. This awareness is what knows all these experiences. But even this awareness is not a permanent self. Awareness arises dependently. It requires objects to be aware of. When there is nothing being observed, where is the awareness? Even consciousness, the Buddha taught, is part of the 5 aggregates, not a permanent soul or self. Everything you can observe, everything you can experience is not self. It is all constantly changing, all dependently arising, all empty of permanent essence. This practice of observing experience without identifying with it is how the ego begins to dissolve. You are not fighting against the ego. You are not trying to destroy it or get rid of it. You are simply seeing clearly that the ego, the sense of being a separate permanent self, is a construction, a habit of mind, not an actual entity. When this seeing becomes clear and stable, something remarkable happens. The anxiety that comes from constantly defending and maintaining a self begins to release. The comparison and competition that come from ego identification start to dissolve. The fear of death loses its grip because you realize there was never a permanent self to die in the first place. What dies is just the body and the temporary constellation of aggregates that you labeled as yourself, but there was never an unchanging essence that could be lost. As you deepen in this understanding, you will begin to notice signs of liberation emerging in your daily life. The first sign is a profound sense of lightness and relief. It is as if you have been carrying an enormous burden your entire life, and you finally set it down. The burden was the ego, the constant need to defend, maintain, improve, and satisfy this phantom self. When you see through the illusion, when you understand that there is no fixed self that needs all this attention and protection, you are free to simply be present with what is arising now, without all the extra weight of ego identification. Another sign is a dramatic reduction in suffering around what others think of you. When someone criticizes you and you believe in a solid self, the criticism feels like an attack on who you are at your core. But when you understand Anatta, when you see that there is no fixed self to be attacked, criticism becomes just information, just sounds and words arising in the present moment. You can consider whether the criticism contains useful feedback without taking it as a personal assault. Similarly, praise does not inflate you because you recognize there is no permanent self to be inflated. Both praise and blame become like weather patterns, arising and passing, not defining or determining your fundamental worth, because there is no fundamental self to have worth or lack it. You will also notice that conflicts and relationship difficulties begin to ease. So much conflict comes from ego clashing with ego, from the need to be right, to win, to dominate, to prove yourself. When you see through the illusion of a separate self, when you understand that the other person is also just a collection of changing aggregates with no permanent essence, compassion arises naturally. You stop taking their behavior so personally because you recognize that their actions arise from conditions, from their own suffering and confusion, not from some permanent evil self. You can respond to difficult situations with wisdom and kindness rather than defensive reactivity, because you are not constantly protecting an ego that needs defending. Perhaps the most beautiful sign of realizing Anatta is the emergence of genuine compassion and connection. This might seem paradoxical. You might think that if there is no self, then there would be no capacity for love or care, but the opposite is true. When the barriers of ego dissolve, when you are not constantly defending your separate self against other separate selves, true connection becomes possible. You recognize that all beings are like you, temporary collections of changing phenomena, all experiencing some degree of suffering, all seeking happiness and peace. The artificial separation created by ego identification drops away, and what remains is a natural care for all life. Not because it serves your interests, but because the interests of self and other are no longer so clearly divided. I want you to understand something crucial about the practice of realizing Anatta. This is not about becoming emotionless or detached from life in a cold way. Some people fear that if they let go of ego, they will become passive or indifferent, like a robot going through the motions without any real engagement. But this is a complete misunderstanding. When you realize non-self, you do not lose the ability to function in the world. You still use personal pronouns for convenience. You still make choices and take actions. You still form relationships and care about outcomes. What changes is the quality of your engagement. You participate fully in life, but without the heavy burden of ego identification. You care deeply, but without the suffering that comes from defending a phantom self. The Buddha taught that understanding Anatta does not mean the conventional self disappears entirely. It means you see through its ultimate nature as empty of permanent essence. You continue to function as an individual in the relative world, but you are no longer imprisoned by the illusion that this individual is a fixed permanent entity that must be protected at all costs. This is what the Buddha meant by the middle way applied to the question of self. He rejected both the extreme of believing in a permanent, unchanging soul and the extreme of believing that nothing exists at all. The truth is in the middle. There is conventional selfhood that functions in the world, but there is no ultimate, permanent self that can be found when you look closely. Let me give you a practice you can use throughout your day to weaken the grip of ego and realize the truth of Anatta more directly. Whenever you notice yourself thinking in terms of I or me or mine, pause for just a moment and investigate. When you think I am angry, ask yourself, Where is this I that is angry? Can I find it? Or is there just the experience of anger arising in awareness with no permanent self who owns it? When you think this is my possession, ask, where is the me that possesses it? Is there not just a temporary relationship between this body-mind process and this object, both of which are constantly changing? When you think I need to protect myself, ask, what self needs protecting? Can I find a permanent, unchanging entity anywhere, or just a flow of changing experiences? This investigation is not meant to be aggressive or forceful. It is gentle curiosity, a kind and patient looking into the nature of experience. Over time, as you practice this inquiry, the automatic identification with thoughts, feelings, and experiences as me and mine begins to loosen. You start to live more from the space of awareness itself rather than from the contracted perspective of a separate ego. This is the journey toward nirvana, toward complete liberation from suffering through the realization of Anatta. As we come toward the close of this teaching, I want you to recognize that what I have shared with you today is the Buddha's most radical and liberating insight. For 25 centuries, practitioners have discovered that understanding Anatta, seeing through the illusion of a permanent self, is the key that unlocks the door to freedom. Your ego, that sense of being a separate, independent, permanent entity, is the source of so much fear, so much anxiety, so much suffering. But it is not real. But it is a construction, a habit of identification that can be seen through and released. When you truly understand this, when you realize it not just intellectually but in your direct experience, the ego dissolves on its own, and what remains is a peace and freedom beyond anything the ego could ever achieve. I invite you to practice this understanding today, right now, in this very moment. Look for the self and see if you can find it. Observe your experience and notice that everything you can observe is not you, is just phenomena arising and passing in awareness. If this teaching resonates with your deepest intuition, if you feel called to walk this path of liberation with me, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue exploring the Dharma together. Leave in the comments the phrase we spoke of at the beginning: I release attachment and embrace impermanence. Let this be your declaration of freedom from the prison of ego, your willingness to see the truth that will dissolve your suffering at its root. The Buddha discovered that the power of Anatta to dissolve the ego is immediate and complete when you truly see it. May you discover this freedom for yourself. May you awaken to the truth of who you are beyond all concepts of self. May you know the peace that comes when the burden of ego finally falls away and you rest in the vast open awareness that has always been here, never born, never dying, free from the beginning.